EDH isn't my favorite way to play Magic. That plum belongs easily and entirely to Cube, but Cube has this famous problem that you basically never get to actually play it, and especially since I haven't lived near my MTG playing friends for about 4 years, and it was COVID just before that, the time spent preparing and tinkering with my Cube projects versus actually playing them in any capacity really multiplied. And despite all that, I absolutely will never give up on Cube, to the point that I've worked to play Cube over Arena for the last couple of years. To do this, I grind limited on a few accounts and use the wild cards earned from that to craft decks that my friends and I draft on Draftmancer and then import to Arena, and as you can see, this is already kind of a numbing level of commitment for the reward of firing a 4-person online draft like once or twice a month. Cube is really important to me though, and I think genuinely it is the greatest game of all time. So of course I'm going to go through all these obscene hurdles just to play even the Shadow in the Cave version of Cube. And what's really beautiful about Cube and limited Magic more broadly is the moment you open a pack and in the best of worlds you see like 4 or more cards that each represent a valid direction. So you take one and start riffing with the cards in the next pack and so on until you start hearing jazz. And Commander deck building at its best feels like a grand orchestral version of one of those improvisations because you get access to pretty much every card in the history of the game, and you can really dig in and make the most developed and singular and authored version of that little idea using cards that are way too narrow and way too slow and way too convoluted to pull off in a typical game of limited or 60-card constructed. And EDH almost has a contrasting problem to Cube, where it's reasonably easy to play a platonic game of it, but it's the process of preparing for that game, of making the deck, of uncovering the potential of a given legend that is often far more gratifying and motivating than anything you do once the game starts. And this owes largely to EDH being a fan-made hack of Magic that basically only works in pristine conditions where everyone has agreed to build their decks according to the same, somewhat undefinable principles. Which is precisely why there is such a ridiculous wealth of videos and other community discourse over just figuring out like how to play what is ostensibly a casual game. It's the reason I have something to talk about right here. And apart from the revolting syntax issue of the word commander referring potentially to either the format itself or the individual card that leads one's deck, it's why I say EDH and not commander when I talk about the format. Because whether or not it's the most popular way to play the game, and whether or not Wizards recognizes its legitimacy and thinks up new cards just for it, EDH is not the game that Magic was designed to be. But regardless of that, EDH is outstandingly popular, and that is somewhat to do with what has become the promise of actual EDH gameplay, the opportunity to do your thing, as it is often put, which more exactly means something like enact your strategy as defined by your commander. To the extent that a consensus exists, the consensus point of EDH is to have a reasonable opportunity to do this in as many games as possible. But that ability to strictly define what thing your deck does, the perfection of linear determinate deck building, takes its own kind of toll. Our certainty about having the 8th card, the commander, always available to us, and to be reasonably sure what purpose the card serves in winning us the game, is also to forget the joy of discovery we feel in the deck building process. The designs of cards that can be your commander typically encourage players to imagine what can be accomplished when they always have access to some ongoing or repeatable effect that often dramatically shifts the context for the main deck. In the most extreme cases, when a commander's effect is not easily replicable or stackable, the main deck becomes nearly unplayable absent the commander. Naturally, players often choose commanders with exciting and splashy effects because this is where the rest of the strategy stems from. And if the point of the format is to execute the strategy their commander demands, this is only natural. The rules around the commander itself, how it is always available to cast, no matter how many times it gets destroyed or exiled or placed anywhere besides the battlefield, encourage players to deck build under the premise that they will have consistent access to the effect of the card. And this is kind of true. You can rely on having your commander available to drop on curve, but also the commander tax and the ever-increasing pace of the format mean that the protections for the commander card are less and less relevant every day. There's a tension here in that the designs of cards that can be your commander and the rules of the format itself encourage players to imagine that these effects will be ever present despite their generally belonging to creatures with no meaningful way to protect themselves. And yes, 1-for-1 removal is generally a bad deal in multiplayer, and a lot of players just don't play much anyway. And those are both factors, combined with the aforementioned rules privileges the commander card enjoys, that mean you can get away with hinging your strategy on a fragile commander some amount of the time. However, if a commander is the difference between a deck functioning as a threat to win or not, which is precisely the kind of deck building that lots of commander designs encourage, whatever removal players are packing is probably headed that way. And it's totally apparent that the majority of EDH players are struggling with this tension because 2 of the 3 most popular commanders per EDH rec function as untouchable emblems the majority of the time. The Dragon and Edgar Markov both have Eminence abilities active in the command zone. And when I was into EDH the first time around, when Wizards had just begun to officially recognize and design for the format, Aloro Ageless Ascetic was a revelatory and hugely popular commander because of his unprecedented ability that triggered from the command zone. Even though it's a relatively marginal life gain effect, the comfort he provides, the guarantee that you can stuff your deck full of life gain synergies and combos that will never be without their other half, no matter what the opponent does, was to see the fantasy vision of commander that we experience in the deck building stage fulfilled in actual gameplay. To this day, Aloro is the only commander I've seen built by more than one person in a playgroup I was part of. And if the EDH rec numbers accurately reflect the real-life format of EDH, I bet a lot of people have had similar experiences with Edgar and the Dragon too. After players get a bit of experience seeing their commanders removed and their ability to thing-do taken with it, they start to see something mega attractive in this certainty. These command zone effect cards were made to address the tension in EDH where commanders want to be ever present despite belonging to the most fragile and interactable card type in the game. The reason these Eminence cards are so popular is because of how they assure players that they will get to play in the correct environment for their deck to function always. The Dragon is a guarantee that your dragon spells will all be much more castable, and Edgar guarantees that playing a bunch of vampires will be a good value move. Your opponents will never get a chance to prevent that from being the case. There have been other workaround designs for commanders as well. For one example, the experience counter cards make sure that the power of the commander's effect scales consistently throughout the game, even if it gets removed, so the commander can start at a reasonable cost but still pay you back for recasting it later on, an improvement on the Animar Soul of Elements design where +1/+1 counters scale the power of the effect, and thus the design relies on color protections to make Animar less able to be removed at all, rather than just lowering the reward for removing it. Or we can look at Henzi Toolbox Torre, whose cost reduction ability scales the more he gets removed. The Theros gods were an earlier attempt at this sort of mitigation as well, where they are technically creatures for the purpose of being your commander, but no one is realistically going to be able to answer an indestructible enchantment very often. And honestly, you can quibble with the specific ways any of these cards have been designed and balanced, but I think that if the goal of the format is performing a strategy that hinges on the commander, then the approach of limiting or discouraging interaction with the commander itself has a lot of merit. If people are supposed to be building entirely around an effect being present in the game, can't we make sure that they don't have to worry about someone completely ruining their game plan with like a single well-timed swords or counterspell? To some extent, the social contract can be relied on as a guide for people's deck building choices, but part of that contract is playing some removal. I think at least most people would say so. And once you get into an actual game, it's ridiculous to think that players will regularly ignore their ability to disrupt the most obviously integral pieces of their opponent's game plan, even though it is probably a bad solution to totally disallow any interaction on that axis. And I think we can safely say from experience that EDH always teetering on this edge ceases to be a game at all when people are regularly and purposely taking non-optimal actions. I've had a Xenagos God of Revels deck since Born of the Gods released, and the deck has lasted so long for some stretches being my only EDH deck, because it's reliably fun to play, in large part because I can almost always access the commander's ability, and the only thing my opponents can reasonably do to disrupt that is counterspelling. While the strategy of that deck is brutally simple, it can still feel pretty unfair that once Xenagos resolves, it can't be efficiently removed by almost any card someone would reasonably have access to in an EDH game. And I've seen how frustrating it can be for my opponents that Xenagos' ability doesn't necessarily make it a better idea for them to remove my beaters over the card that's buffing them entirely out of control. It's just what they have to settle for. And to Wizards' credit, they've definitely made some commanders that limit and discourage interaction in more subtle and interesting and elegant ways. For a recent example, I really love Kilo Apogee Mind because even though there's nothing about it that outright forbids interaction, it's cheap and usually gets off one activation because of the haste. Beyond that, Proliferate is an ability that naturally scales with the size of the game being played, so Kilo can remain a relevant play as his cost increases. And Kilo is still often worth removing and can be very threatening in combination with other cards, but the stakes for letting it ride versus blasting it on sight are a lot closer and demand more consideration of context than with many commanders. Perhaps most significantly, Kilo's effect stacks really nicely. There are plenty of cheap cards that let you proliferate already, and proliferating more is always good in a proliferate deck, so you're much more likely to build a resilient and functional deck around Kilo than you are with commanders who offer more specialized effects. And this is the case for some of the most popular archetypes in EDH too, like Sacrifice and Aristocrats decks, which usually have commanders like Teza Karlov and Judith the Scourge Diva, who act as multipliers on their strategy rather than totally reshaping the value and meaning of the main deck cards. There's often a lot less reason for opponents to send removal at these decks because they can't be so easily hindered by pulling out one gear in the machine when it's so easily replaced. The downside to this in terms of gameplay fun, because as far as power is concerned it's awesome to have tons of redundant effects, is that decks like this tend to be very one-note. In other words, they do the thing too effectively, and the thing they do almost always looks the same, to the point that games lose texture. The more cards are interchangeable, the potential for a surprise, the potential for something cool and unexpected to happen, i.e. one of the big reasons to play this casual format in the first place, diminishes. Too far in the other direction, though, with the very specialized commanders, and the deck becomes way too fragile, such that it doesn't work especially well in a setting where people are packing any reasonable interaction for each other. For example, Joda the Unifier, Krenko Mob Boss, Pantlaza Sun Favored, Miriam Sentinel Worm, Ulalek Fused Atrocity, and Brego King Eternal are all quite expensive, unlikely to do much unless they're still around for the next turn, and the upside for removing them is that the deck they command goes from a high-speed value snowball to medium bad mid-range pile. Commanders like these tend to eat a chain of removal effects anytime they threaten huge relevance, while the more resilient and flexible decks can continue to advance a form of their game plan. And I think it's actually great for the game to have card designs that are ridiculously threatening, but require surviving around at the table in order to make good on that threat. The issue occurs when these cards become commanders, and players are encouraged to always view these cards not as mere rewards for their strategy, but as the default state their deck must assume in order for them to enjoy playing the game, because then it's easy to feel frustrated that the game has let you down on the promise of doing the thing, when the weak point this creates in the strategy is routinely exploited. So, when we all four players sit down at the table, if our decks are these immaculate and singular compositions, ones we've labored to refine, and if we've each independently already largely decided what we're going to play, which cards go in which order, and what our deck is meant to do, and so on, what is that going to sound like? Will it feel better if we scramble to reroute and prevent each other from realizing our respective visions? Or should we sit side by side and pretend that we can't hear each other? I think I've made it quite clear that I'm discussing EDH in the popular casual way, and in this setting I think strong interaction and particularly access to some targeted removal is a major good for fun gameplay, which is different from me saying that targeted removal is powerful. There is in fact a lot of merit to the philosophy that you should not bother playing actual removal very much, because one-for-one exchanges are dreadfully bad on principle in a multiplayer format. And at the level of just trying to win as many games as possible, you will have a very different relationship with this aspect of the game, as evidenced by the chimeric pseudo format of CEDH. But casually, removal is one of those necessary delusions that allows the game of EDH to play out in a fun way at all, because then it's not merely about who brought the deck that accrues the most and fastest resources sufficient to totally break the economy, whether that means a literal combo or not. And instead, we can facilitate some kind of meaningful exchange between decks that might have, in reality, quite different power levels, because collectively the other players have the means to slow the best deck down. I guess what I'm saying is that removal is really bad fundamentally, but part of EDH is that we're making decks for each other too, not just ourselves. And everyone needs to believe in their responsibility to save a slot for Doomblade. This is your contribution to the collection plate. That's why I thank my opponents for swordsing my Consecrated Sphinx, or countering my Genesis Wave, or needling my Borborygmos, because that answer in their deck means they thought, even for just a moment, more about the fun I was going to have than the fun they were going to have. If you want to play a game that isn't held together entirely by social contracts, there's always every other way to play Magic. But if you're set on EDH, it's TS, because these are the conditions that EDH requires us to create in order to have a worthwhile experience, even though it's also the environment that many popular Commander designs want to pretend doesn't exist. And so, unless you are down to give in and let it be a parallel play game-adjacent show and tell, then isn't this format kind of suggesting for us to step over and over on the rake that is thinking we'll goldfish out the worst and greediest strategies, and in different ways keep designing new ironic punishments for our total befouling of that most genius and pure game system ever wrought? And maybe it's the case that we should suffer thusly for forgetting what made it worth all the trouble of sitting in late Friday into early Saturday improvised saunas of dork heat, releasing afterward into cool night air, and then the Del Taco, where we could speak simply and hoarsely of how, dude, Wingmate Rock is unbeatable. I want to talk now about my favorite EDH deck, the one that has gotten me back into the format in a big way, which is commandered by Kalia, Zenith Seeker. Last summer, an EDH renaissance began in my playgroup, who met in college and bonded over MTG in a big way, but have geographically dispersed such that playing in person is a rare and treasured occurrence. But anyway, we started playing EDH on Magic Online, with the restrictions that our decks could only contain cards that cost 1 or 2 cents. Digitally, this is also the basis for a neat 60-card format called Penny Dreadful, a search function for which is helpfully supported on Scryfall. So we lifted the idea to play some cheap games. And by the way, if you are in similar circumstances with your playgroup, this was an awesome way to brew and play new decks and stretch the deck building muscles, and it will give you a good reason to check out some super underappreciated commanders. Kalia Zenith Seeker still has fewer than 700 decks on EDH Rec, and I myself probably would have kept overlooking her except for the limited card pool we were working with. I highly recommend taking up the penny tradition if you can stand the MTGO interface. My original version of Kalia Zenith Seeker was a clunky mid-range list with whatever the most generically powerful angels, demons, and dragons available were, like Deathbringer Regent, Kokusho the Evening Star, Sarah's Emissary, Gisela Blade of Gold Knight. Just big dumb spells. To reach a nice density of hits for Kalia, I also add some smaller utility creatures with particular attention to blink and reanimate effects. Guardian of Girapur, Restoration Angel, Karmic Guide, Bruna the Fading Light, and Bringer of the Last Gift. And because Kalia herself keeps your hand stocked with huge dudes and often causes you to discard to hand size if she's cast on curve, not to mention the decent number of angels, demons, and dragons with cycling, I settled on reanimation as a primary game plan. Luckily, a few mass reanimation spells were also legal, so I added Patriarch's Bidding and Haunted Voyage as more payoff for my limited creature types. To fill the graveyard more quickly, I threw in a few red looting effects, just whatever Tormenting Voice variants were legal. And this is more or less still the basis of the deck, but the themes have become much more refined and the cards much more sophisticated as I've lifted the penny restriction for my paper deck. I am allowing myself now to engage in the refined slop content practice of the EDH deck tech, in part because I'm excited about my cool Kalia deck and in part to clearly illustrate this idea about the commander's role that I'm getting around to. The most notable addition to my deck in paper form is the World Gorger Dragon combo. I have a lot of affection for this combo because of my nostalgia for the 2010s MTGO Holiday Cube, and I want Kalia to be able to hang with some of the stronger of my friends' decks, so having a win con besides just turning guys sideways is important. But besides just making the deck stronger, I really enjoy the variety this combo adds and the way it complements the other strategies present in the deck. World Gorger itself is pretty strictly just for this combo, but the other halves of the combo are all just efficient reanimation spells that are good in the deck anyway. Abdul Adrian offers a bit of redundancy for the combo, but he's also just a totally fine blink value card that can pop off with Astral Slide and Astral Drift. And beyond that, Adrian has the bonus of tying into the very light human theme I have in this deck, and by light I mean there are literally just 4 humans, including Kalia herself, and the theme is basically just my obvious pet card, Angel of Glory's Rise. I've largely let go of the Tormenting Voice variants, just keeping the more explosive Cathartic Reunion and Thrilling Discovery alongside other efficient discard outlets like Faithless Looting and Brass's Tunnel Grinder. Without the card restrictions, I have a much better balance and density of angels, demons, and dragons, so Kalia pretty regularly draws 2 to 3 cards, and discarding to hand size often puts plenty of fuel in the graveyard. The addition of bounce lands as well is awesome for a turn 2 discard outlet that just turns into straight up card advantage in the late game. And there's the minor tech play of bouncing a cycling land back to hand, but I can't pretend that I've ever done that. Anyway, just consistently hitting land drops is overpowered in EDH, and that's exactly what I'm about. The only real ramp I play is Unexpected Windfall and Big Score. I love these as instant speed 4s that curve well with Kalia and can set up a surprise big turn. Rapacious Dragon is another ramp card, but it serves more of a purpose as a late game combo-ish engine alongside the blink cards. And my favorite play pattern in this deck is chaining together these different blink and reanimation effects. Probably my favorite card to cast is this somewhat forgettable Dragons of Tarkir uncommon Swift Warkite. Warkite's effect is an ETB that either reanimates or sneaks in a 3 CMC or less creature and then returns it to hand at end of turn. So, of course, the most typical use is to reanimate Kalia and then get it back in hand, which provides just a ton of card advantage. But if I have a Guardian of Girapur in hand or grave, that's just a free extra trigger on Warkite's effect. And if I have a Priest of Fellrights, it effectively reanimates whatever I want instead, or it can grab something like Phyrexian Dragon Engine to cycle my whole hand. When you bring in some similar effects like Karmic Guide Restoration Angel, Angel of Glory's Rise, Bladewing the Risen, and Angel of Indemnity, you can start building some huge value chains. And I don't mean to go over every single card in the deck, but I just hope to illustrate how the deck is constructed from a few overlapping strategies that collectively encircle and benefit from Kaalia just as you'd hope and expect from a typical EDH deck, but don't completely rely on her just to function at all. I initially picked up Kaalia Zenith Seeker because the idea of a deck full of sweet angels, demons, and dragons has an obvious appeal that I don't think needs explaining, at least not yet. It's exactly why the original Kaalia of the Vast is still the 5th most popular commander, despite being a super linear paint-by-numbers design and also kind of unplayable if your friends have moved beyond circa 2013 EDH principles. In fact, the 2 Kaalia cards perfectly represent what I'm trying to show about what doing your thing can look like and how your commander fits into that. Because Kaalia of the Vast is meant to be the game-changing reward that you get for building your deck according to her needs. And this combined with the fact that she does nothing to protect herself as a 2/2 4-mana flyer that dies to basically every single playable removal spell means the reward for killing her is that the rest of the deck can't function for the next several turns. She turns Swords to Plowshares into a 100 for 1. It may sound like a power level complaint, and that's certainly a factor, but really it's about the play patterns that she and other fragile, specialized commanders can incentivize. KOTV only demonstrates the very worst case for this kind of design. If doing your thing, the point of EDH, is synonymous with enacting a strategy centered on your commander's ability, then Kaalia of the Vast and similar card designs make the reward for your opponents preventing you from experiencing the point of the game almost inconceivably high. And it's impossible for me to talk about the issues with this strain of commander design without bringing up the putrid duo of Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. The footwear equipments are genuinely awful in a power level sense, and personally I outright refuse to include them in any deck. But it's because of this problem with commander designs that they are perceived as EDH staples anyways. And okay, Lightning Greaves has some marginal applications as a combo card because it equips for 0, but come on, this is not how the card got to be an EDH staple. When you have these relatively fragile commanders as the card the rest of the deck is supposed to run through, the pilot is likely to be terrified of and scarred by their commander getting popped. All a Kaalia of the Vast player can do is play the commander quickly and hope they get a chance to attack. Either no one has it, or KOTV eats the removal spell, and a million mana of creatures rot in hand. Since that's how the deck needs to operate, these equipments start making a terrible kind of sense. They start talking to you like the Green Goblin mask, enticing with the vision of actually getting another trigger off your commander, that your deck will do the thing. Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves are in 27 and 25% of all decks considered by EDH Rec, which is to say about a quarter of all commander decks because they're colorless cards. And the fact that these cards are so readily included in precons just completes this terrible cycle for how players imagine the role the commander serves in most decks. The truth is that the opportunity cost to include these cards is tragically especially ridiculous in linear decks like Kaalia of the Vast, where the commander themselves is such a key piece to keep in play, where every card in your deck needs to be pointing in the same direction in order to get anything worthwhile back. Moreover, the targeted interaction most people pack in current year EDH is cheap and instant speed, meaning they can still blast your commander while they're fumbling with the laces on Swiftfoot Boots. This is my done with the 90s movement. Kaalia of the Vast played against milkmen and plumbers, and her ankles are getting snapped in today's game whether or not she's rocking a pair of Lightning Greaves. Then again, Kaalia of the Vast would be a reasonably fun if underpowered card for me to play in a Kaalia Zenith Seeker deck because she's just one of many ways to leverage the big angels, demons, and dragons I'd have in hand. If I happen to draw her, she curves nicely with the commander and lets me drop one of the cards Zenith Seeker digs for. If my opponents feel the need to remove Kali of the Vast, it's no big deal because my deck has plenty of other threats and isn't positioned just to maximize the immediate threat of KOTV's specific effect. When Kali of the Vast is the commander, however, you're basically required to go all in on her as the threat because that's the role she has and the value she provides as an 8th card in hand. You can't reasonably spend your early turns filtering through your deck or anything like that because the longer you wait to cast Kalia, the more you bleed the advantage she provides you as a guaranteed 4-drop threat. Therefore, your deck has to be stocked almost exclusively with cards that accelerate into Kalia and cards that are good to drop with Kalia. And depending on how browbeaten and or disciplined you are, cards that protect and haste give her. If you can't cast her on time and you don't have an insane threat to drop when she gets a trigger, then why is she your commander? And if your commander is itself a massive threat that you have to maximize, you're also maximizing the reward your opponents get for dispatching your commander and denying you from doing your thing. Meanwhile, though, if your commander just greases the wheels for threats in the rest of your deck, if doing your thing becomes a broad category of effects that leverage the value created by your commander, your opponents will have to engage with each of those threats in a different way. And it's much less likely they'll identify an obvious target that will totally cripple the deck. Kali Zenith Seeker is analogous to Edgar Markov or the Dragon or Oloro in this way, because she just provides a reasonable guarantee that the deck properly functions, but she doesn't herself represent anything that the opponent can or would want to interact with. And that is a major difference, to be fair, because Kalia doesn't feel as frustrating as those commands and effects since it's still just a normal card you cast. You can totally interact with it, there just isn't much reason to do so most of the time. And this is very different also to decks that de-emphasize the role of the commander as maybe an eventual finisher or generic value piece, because the whole deck still runs through Kalia Zenith Seeker. She's not just an interchangeable card. And okay, I could probably be fine running Chell's Rune Knight, but also, I want a reason to play with these sick angels, demons, and dragons, instead of just the best reanimation targets that anyone can get. This is EDH, and having a compelling prompt to work off of is a plus. It's cool that I have a reason to play Crib Swap and Nameless Inversion as my removal spells. And this imagination-stoking aspect of Kalia owes precisely to her emerging from Magic's natural design process, where the mechanics of the cards and the narratives they portray are in dialogue and can influence each other. She was created to serve the purpose of being a character who tied together angels, demons, and dragons for no reason other than that's a neat deck building premise in the context of Magic specifically. And that's only possible because she exists only in the fiction of the card game and therefore expresses herself fluently in Magic's language. I don't know, and I don't care if Chell's card is a genuine or clever depiction of the original character from Final Fantasy. The point is that her design serves another master, and it definitionally perverts the language of Magic to express ideas from another game, another world with another set of values. This process is ugly and incomplete, and exactly why the typical paths for universes beyond design are either totally bland as to feel purposeless like Chell's, or so precisely exactly only of their own out-of-Magic identity as to clatch with and stretch grossly our game's mechanics to look like theirs. See The Wise Mothman and its despicable rad counters. I read the Kalia lore to prepare for this video, and the Kalia lore is like replacement level fantasy fiction that barely even hints at why she has the effects her card does. But that's fine, because it's not about the prose that you can write about her. It's about an idea that can be elegantly expressed in the form of a magic card. And the original Kalia was at least an aesthetically intriguing card, and Kalia Zenith Seeker is a seriously beautiful card because of the symmetry the card's narrative sets across from her mechanics. She is connected for whatever reason to 3 creature types, each of which is historically represented in the game by one of 3 colors of her casting cost. And she's a 3 CMC 3/3 who draws up to 3 cards. Magic wants to give us this card. The skeleton fits in the skin rather than straining oddly and pushing against or out of it. Because, like, look at the card they made for Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane Watson doesn't like Spider-Mans, much less spiders in general. She likes Peter Parker. And his card doesn't even trigger hers except for the literal spider token it creates. But spider is a creature type in Magic, and so this is the design that you make if you are just obligated to force there to be a Mary Jane Watson in this unrelated card game. I like Spider-Man and I love Magic the Gathering, and I feel punished for being a fan of both Spider-Man and Magic the Gathering when I look at this card. And not just because of the treasonously hideous Steve Argyle artwork. How is this the art on the Mary Jane Watson card when there's more than 50 years of expert and existing drawings of her? The art doesn't fit in either the greater Magic aesthetic or a Marvel comic. So why did we do this? Did Argyle turn in an especially offensively breasty artwork that had to be scrapped for this sub-AI quality rendering? I legitimately can't make sense of how art this awful ended up on a card for one of the most popular characters in one of the biggest deal crossovers in which Magic has yet indulged. But at least if you are just a mechanics guy, this is a perfect card for your green-black spider tribal EDH deck. Or at least she would be if either they made a less awkward compromise than the ones they already have by making her mono green, or Wizards had the guts to let people play hybrid cards in either color of EDH deck because that's the whole point of hybrid mana. This can't be though, since, like Universes Beyond cards, EDH is itself a cobbled grotesque, an approximation of an existing and elemental system crudely rigged to serve another purpose but unable to forget its original self, the ruined beauty of which shines through in even the darkest moments. What we have done to this game means we don't deserve cards like Kalia Zenith Seeker arriving from the sky to save the blasphemers format EDH, but they do appear still, maybe because we haven't strayed so far that we can't someday return to paradise, and maybe just to remind us cruelly of what was lost. A star so brilliantly gleaming we see it from all the way down in hell, taunting us or guiding us home. Running a commander who tees up the rest of your deck rather than building a deck that strictly tees up a commander is cause to make more relevant and interesting decisions once you're in the game. Not to mention, these kind of decks are also often much more powerful on account of their resilience and efficient use of the command zone as a means to reliably rev the engine rather than storage for a miles away telegraphed haymaker. This is a well-trod notion, and it isn't necessarily hard to find these more workmanlike commanders, but this advice also can't be evenly applied to every kind of deck. Depending on what specifically you're trying to play, there might not be a more responsible commander to choose. Like, for instance, if you have an Obika Splitter of Seconds deck, I don't know how you could possibly maintain that premise without such a fragile commander. And even setting aside availability, EDH is popular because you get to guarantee access to and build around a unique legendary creature and fulfill the loftiest fantasies about what that card can accomplish. That's kind of what you're supposed to do, and if you are looking for that experience from EDH, then you are supposedly in the right place, because that's the experience that almost all commanders are designed to accommodate. And I'm certainly not going to tell you to change your entire idea of fun in this game, because that's another thing that bothers me, is that sometimes people talk about EDH of all things as though the players are pursuing like an associate's degree in +1 counters. Which I understand what that sounds like at the 30-minute mark in the video I personally made about EDH for $0. But that's because I'm not trying to have a good time with regard to Magic the Gathering. I treat Magic the Gathering the way Kevin Durant treats Twitter. There's no relax, champ. The reason I had to make this video is the same reason Kalia Zenith Seeker has fewer decks than Daxos of Miletus. And to be fair, the original Kalia of the Vast has remained an iconic EDH card since her release over 10 years ago, and those who are interested in playing a deck full of these big angels, demons, and dragons likely found it much more straightforward to simply slot Kalia Zenith Seeker into an existing Kalia of the Vast deck rather than totally rethinking what that deck was trying to do. But even if that weren't a factor, I can still tell you that building with a
wheel-greasing commander like Kali Zenith Seeker rather than a fragile threat like Kali of the Vast will give you a stronger and more resilient and thus more consistently fun deck, and you can even believe me when I say it, and you can still want to run Kali of the Vast instead, and I understand why. Other than tradition and nostalgia, Kali of the Vast is so vastly more popular as a commander than her retrain on account of the text box of Kali of the Vast looks crazy. It's way cooler to think about dropping Sarah's Emissary into play on turn 4 than putting it in your hand on turn 3. And a lot of players, of course, feel motivated to make the splashy, game-altering cards their commanders because people make commanders of the cards they're excited to cast. The apparent point of the format, after all, is to see your commander in action doing the thing. I've spent some time describing how players are willing to compromise on the bigness of their commander's effect if it provides a baseline level of consistency, but it's also true that two of the cards I cited as proof, the Ur-Dragon and Edgar Markov, can serve as massive game-ending threats when cast. Even if those modes are more ornamental, they still serve an important purpose in onboarding players to experiencing the role of the commander a bit differently. I don't think it's totally out of the question that we could shift to a reality where these more reliable and marginal effects are significantly more available to and popular in the command zone. For instance, Giada Font of Hope is currently the 12th ranked commander on EDH Rec, and she's just a bad mana dork. And sure, you can't just use the outsized popularity of any specific creature type to get players interested in all the designs like this, but again, that's why I felt motivated to make this video in the first place. The sticky thing for me, though, is that none of these cards necessarily offer the exact sort of responsive and decision-heavy gameplay that Kali Zenith Seeker has made possible in my experience, and which invigorated my ability to actually pine to play EDH. Kali Zenith Seeker is a draw and selection spell, so I feel encouraged to include a suite of toolsy and interactive effects because I can always dig a little bit for the most relevant ones. And the fact that Kali's effect is both immediate and comes in huge chunks of up to 3 cards is also really important for this dynamic too, because besides counterspells, there isn't much way to prevent an ETB at the usual EDH table, whereas if Kalia were like a Phyrexian Arena variant, something that was going to generate a lot of value over time, it's much easier to imagine someone being able to and wanting to remove it. And there's plenty to be said for the design consequences of ETB spam and 1v1 magic, but for cards that are intended to be commanders, ETBs as a primary effect are a great idea. Because I'm reasonably certain I can get a look at my top cards and pick out whichever cards best complement my opening hand, my Kali deck can involve a few different strategies originating from this big bang of her ability. As a baseline, I can use some combination of Reanimation and Blink to build my board and diminish my opponents. And I have cards like Angel of Serenity, Angel of Despair, Boggart and Hellkite, and Angel of the Ruins to churn big ETBs to this end. Other times, I can use a combination of looting and cycling effects to quickly fill my graveyard before dropping a Living Death, and then there's the World Gorger Dragon combo. So the deck can play at a lot of different speeds and can, because of the selection Kali it provides and the overlap between these packages, shift gears pretty seamlessly. And I feel like I'm actually strengthening my deck and my commander rather than bleeding power by accommodating these different angles of attack. Years earlier, I built a Tezkakarlov deck, which was similarly resilient, but only because the cards were so interchangeable the deck could reliably perform the same basic strategy regardless of what the opponents were doing. In the end, I took this deck apart with a single-digit number of games played because there was just nothing left to experience. The key, again, is that Kali provides some choice in the role she plays and the resources she provides. When she enters and I rip the top 6 of my library, it's like I'm looking at a miniature pack of cards, and I get a moment to take into consideration the rest of my hand and the current board state and the commanders my opponents are playing, and for a moment, I'm drafting, if only in a small way. And maybe the choice is just like, do I want Guardian of Ghirapur or Karmic Guide, but that choice can still guide me down a totally different path where I'm more or less concerned with immediately filling my graveyard and establishing some kind of threat versus just drawing through more of my deck for untold value. Or maybe the choice Kali gives me is totally obvious, or maybe I just hit one each of Angel, Demon, and Dragon. But that potential to hit big and get an above-rate effect out of Kalia also contributes to the variety of play patterns in the deck. And no matter what, in a sense, I'm building a version of my deck for the specific game as I'm playing it. And this is totally different from a traditional toolbox commander like Sasei, because even if I do have a perfect answer for whatever somewhere in my deck, I only get to see 6 cards from the top, and I have to then work out additional ways to re-trigger Kalia beyond the initial cast, and then I have to piece together something from whatever she does dig into, rather than having a suite of silver bullet perfect answers that never have to touch each other but just sit in the deck waiting to be called up. The design of my commander has made me build a deck of various overlapping strategies that can coexist healthily because of this minor selection Kalia provides. In essence, Kalia Zenith Seeker made me construct my deck as a responsive play environment rather than a single-purpose machine, and I didn't even have to push totally aside my spiky tendencies to reach this point. This is the way the commander wants to be built. This is what the card is telling you to do. And so I want to encourage choosing commanders that operate more like Zenith Seeker than Kali of the Vast. Commanders that can help your deck adapt its game plan and provide fuel rather than burn it. That ask questions of you rather than demand answers from your opponents. I wanted this to be my ultimate conclusive dig, but it turns out that there are really not many commanders who are in this respect anything like Kalia Zenith Seeker. There are a few cards with similar selection abilities like Aster Bearer of Blades and Boromir Gondor's Hope, and I do like these designs, but also 4 mana starts to feel like kind of a lot. At that point, that's really when you'd like to be actually affecting the board, and if the commander does have a relevant onboard ability you're paying for, you start having to build around that in a more significant way. Herald King of Skemfar is cheap too, but the options for the types he looks at aren't quite as storied with sick and unique designs, so the selection does feel a bit less important, and he also only gets 1 card, so the possible outcomes are much more limited. Gonti, Lord of Luxury, and other card-stealing effects are also neat to me for a lot of the same reasons, but they also feel like an archetype unto themselves and typically require you to build your own deck a bit more generically so that you can make use of whatever cards you're able to nab off your opponent. Kalia Zenith Seeker strikes this amazing balance with cost and restriction and permission that make it such a lovely deck building and play experience, one that I don't really see a clear parallel for. Kalia Zenith Seeker almost instantly became my favorite deck to play, and if you've ever felt sad to take your deck out of the conversational, improvisational deck building phase and calcify it in paper, where it will be condemned to the Sisyphean fate of doing the thing, I think you can find another path, even if there are vanishingly few commanders who will tell you to look for it, who hit the board and open up the possibility space for what your deck can do rather than narrowing it, rather than telling your opponents, somebody stop me or I'll do the thing. So I mourn the as of yet unrealized world Kalia Zenith Seeker's design represents, but I also celebrate and cherish her, crowned now as my favorite Magic card of the Commander era. I want to say thanks to the WotC employee or employees who designed this card, and I want to thank you, the viewer, for watching this video about a Magic format that I don't like very much, and the one card that was able to make it all better.